Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Going Deeper, the fourth of the series. And you'll notice I've put the word times in red because Ken did the life of John the Baptist over 3 sessions with great detail and clarity. I'm going to look at the times, actually, of John the Baptist and Jesus. And we're going to really try and get an understanding of the background to these great historical figures. But I want to start by telling you 3 stories, because I love telling stories. So, I want to tell you about a picture I saw on TV, and it was a close-up of an Iranian woman, and she was covered in a Muslim dress from head to toe. You couldn't see anything of her other than just her eyes, and she had a gun, and it was pointed. And then the camera pans out, and you're all thinking, this is a terrorist. And what she's actually doing is taking part in a shooting competition. Okay, so that's the first one, the Iranian so-called terrorist. Second one, the English Civil War. When I was in my late teens, there was a film about Oliver Cromwell, and did I say the American Civil War? The English Civil War, about Oliver Cromwell. And at one key moment, he meets the king in this film before the Civil War starts, and the king says to Oliver Cromwell, well, what is it that you want? And Cromwell says, well, I want democracy. And at that point, as a history student, I just wept, because the last thing Cromwell ever wanted was democracy. And if you look at that film, I think I still remember seeing cars going along the top of the hill before one of the great battles of the 17th century. So not a great film, not a great film. And then, foreign faux pas. Some years ago, Judy and I went to Brittany, and we were in a hotel, and we came down for breakfast the next morning, and we all went up to the table with all the food on it, and we put all the food on our tray, went back, took everything off the tray and put the tray away. And there were shocked looks all over the real building. There really were. People eating were kind of, what's going on? What are these English people doing? And someone came up and whispered and said, you leave it all on the tray while you're eating. Okay, fine. But we didn't know that context. We had no idea of what that was all about. So what do they all have in common, these 3 stories? And I want to suggest to you that, as with John the Baptist in his time, they're all about context. They're all about properly understanding context. So whoever made the Cromwell film didn't have much history, okay? And the Iranian so-called terrorist, we understood it only as the camera panned out. And we didn't understand the context in which French people eat their breakfast. Hence, the next day and the next day, for the rest of our time at the hotel, we left our food on the tray. So we need to understand context. And I would argue that we misunderstand the Bible regularly because we don't understand the context of what's being written. So this is my menu over the next 2 sessions, actually. I want to start off by trying to explain why biblical context matters. The Bible is a very dangerous book. Now, it's dangerous for many good reasons, but for some bad reasons as well. So I want to try and show why biblical context matters. I want to talk about how that affects the way we read the text itself. We actually come to read a passage. One of the things we regularly don't do is read it in its full context. I read United Christian Broadcasters' Word for Today, and we get one verse, okay? And it's a really, really good. You get lots of thoughts and ideas and challenges, but it's not in context, and there's a danger there. So I wanted to then try and illustrate that by having a look at a particular verse, and again relevant to Jesus in this case. And then we'll get into the real background after that. So we're going to do the historical context today. We'll try and do the cultural context. And then next week we'll look at the social economic context and the religious context of Palestine in the New Testament era at the time of the life of John the Baptist and Jesus. So that's where we're going. And I'm afraid I'm going to be a bit naughty now. Judy, would you mind reading the 1 Corinthians 11 passage, please? If you can do it really loud. And I'd like the ladies in the room to listen particularly carefully.
This is 1 Corinthians 11, verses 3 to 15. Now, I want you to realise that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonours his head, and every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonours her head. It is just as though her head was shaved. If a woman does not cover her head, she should have her hair covered. If it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off or shaved, she should cover her head. A man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of man. The man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither the man created the woman, but woman from man. For this reason, and because of the angels, the woman ought to have a sign of authority on her head. In the Lord, however, this woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as woman came from man, so also man is born of woman. But everything comes from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him, but that if a woman has long hair, it is her glory? The long hair is given to her as a covering.
Thank you, Judy. I love the way she read that. She really, you could see the feeling going on there. So what I want to ask you to do is to say, what on earth is that saying to us in 2026? And I'm looking around and I can see a sea of very guilty female faces here at the moment. So I'm going to go through a list of reasons why Paul might have actually written that. And I'd like you to think to yourself, which of these is relevant to 2026, to now? So let's try the first one. To honour local cultural modesty. Because for a woman to have her hair uncovered, particularly a married woman, was regarded as being disgraceful, not just in the church, but in the whole of Greek society. So that was very relevant for the time. To avoid public disgrace for husbands, because a married woman with her hair uncovered was showing no acceptance of a husband's authority in the ancient world. To avoid disgrace in worship, only promiscuous women have uncovered hair, and that would have been regarded as being true in that period. That would have been regarded as being true. And if a woman was in the cult of Dionysius, which was an extremely sensual, immoral cult, they would have had their heads uncovered. And then finally, to honour God in showing submission to husband, which is the created order. So, which of those is relevant to now? When you look at that, which of those applies to 2026 in Britain? Does that mean that we can completely ignore that passage? I would argue that what it means is we need to apply it in a meaningful, relevant way today. And the way I would apply it would be, we do want order in worship for all of us. We don't want worship to be disordered, unplanned, unstructured, harmful to some people, helpful to others. You can define your own concept of order in worship. That's how I try and apply the relevance of that passage, whereas I don't see it as being relevant for women today in Britain in 2026. So we have to get context. We also have to be aware, by the way, that scholars don't agree what Paul actually meant by the passage in the first place. That's another problem. Okay, so let's move on to what that means in terms of reading the text. I'm working Judy hard today. She's going to stand up and read Luke 19 for us. And again, it's an interesting passage.
Luke 19, 41 to 44. As he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it and said, "If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another, because you did not recognise the time of God's coming to you."
Thank you. That's a pretty shocking passage in all sorts of ways, but it makes more sense if we begin to think about a couple of things. If Jesus died somewhere around AD 30, in AD 70, Jerusalem, having been besieged, was largely destroyed by the Romans. The temple was destroyed. Jewish history was transformed over the next 2,000 years. It really happened, if you like, that prediction of Jesus. It really happened. Now that changes our contextual understanding. How did Matthew and Luke in their passages receive this prediction from Jesus? What did it mean to them at the time? And of course, if Matthew and Luke were written after AD 70, as the majority of scholars think, they could see Jesus' prediction coming true. They knew it had happened, and so they could actually remember that comment by Jesus and put it within their gospel. So again, it's all about seeing the bigger context and understanding accurately and correctly. And that's why scholarship is so important of the Old and New Testament. So I just want to end this little bit, this little rant, if you like, for me, because the Bible is so dangerous. I want to say, how do we read any text or book in the Bible? We start by saying, what does the writer want to say? What does he mean to say? And one example of this is in the book of Romans. Over the last 30 years, there's been a huge reinterpretation of what Paul's actually saying in Romans. An enormous new movement that's gone on, and debate that's gone on about what Paul was really saying in Romans, particularly the passages on the Jewish faith, Romans 9 to 11. How was it understood by hearers? What did it mean to the hearers of the time to whom it was originally aimed? What context did it fit? And then and only then, what does it mean for us today? In other words, the Bible's hard work. It's really hard work. But if we don't do that hard work, we end up with terrible things happening with the Bible. We end up with the southern states of America justifying slavery. We end up with Christian nationalism in the United States, which is so far away from what I regard as true Christian faith as the East from the West. So we end up with very bad misreadings. And if you want to have a look at a classic example, look up Westboro Baptist Church in America. Their theology is vile. It's disgusting. It includes saying, oh, this leading homosexual figure in America just died. That's lovely. He's just having his third day in hell. Isn't that nice? So we have to read the Bible with enormous care. Let's go on to the easy bits. Okay, having made that kind of rant initially, we want context, so let's do context for John the Baptist and Jesus. Let's have a look at some key dates first of all. 721 BC, the fall of Israel. Israel was destroyed by Assyria. Many of its people were taken into exile, and the Assyrians had a very clever way of dominating their empire. They then moved people from elsewhere in the empire to live in what was Israel. And that partly explains the hostility between Jewish people, and as they came to be called Samaritans. Do you remember that in the New Testament? So that when Jesus gives a parable about a good Samaritan, boy, is he being pushy. He is really making a point here. All you people, the priest, you didn't stop for this wounded man. The Levite, you didn't stop, but a Samaritan did. That must really have shocked his hearers. He didn't pull any punches sometimes, as did not John the Baptist. 587, fall of Judah to Babylon. People go into exile. The walls of Jerusalem fall down effectively. The temple is destroyed. Eventually they come back, and the book of Nehemiah recounts that, and the temple is rebuilt, and it's said that people who saw the rebuilt temple cried because it was so small compared to the original. But the temple was rebuilt, Jewish exile ended, and although there was a brief period of Jewish independence, for the most part that area of Palestine was subject to ongoing Persian and Greek influence, and we'll talk about the Greek influence particularly later on, and eventually it was conquered by the Romans in 63 BC under Pompey. So there was no real independence in the post-exile ending period apart from a brief period. And in 37 BC, Herod the Great, I'm a bit worried about the word great here, Herod the Great was installed. Do you remember he's the one who killed all the children? Yeah? He was installed, and he wasn't really a king. He was a client. He was a collaborator. He was put there by the Romans to do what they wanted because he'd shown himself to be pro-Roman. He wasn't even from the area originally. He came from Edom. So he's installed. He rules for a long time. Let's have a look at his rather colourful family. So these are the so-called Herodians. When Herod dies, Herod the Great dies, Archelaus becomes the ruler of Judah. Philip rules in the northeast from 4 BC to AD 34, and Herod Antipas rules Galilee from 4 BC to AD 39, and he's the one, as Ken pointed out to us, I think it was last week, who executed John the Baptist because he'd actually married his brother's wife. Not a terribly nice thing to do, I would suggest to you. So at the end of all of that, Judah became a province, and one of its governors is of course Pontius Pilate from AD 26 to 36. Not a nice man, as we will see. So that's the context in which John the Baptist and Jesus are ministering. And the Herodians became very well known for building wonderful Greek-style buildings and for extending the temple under Herod the Great. Or they were scandalous, like Herod Antipas, or they were violent, aggressive and bloody, like Archelaus. So the Jews are living under this. This is the time of Jesus. They were not loved, the Herodians, by the Jewish population. That's a picture of Caesarea from this period, and you can just see some of the Greek building that's at the back there, and that's where Pontius Pilate actually had his headquarters. He didn't headquarter in Jerusalem. But to make matters worse, the temple priests also ruled, and they had decided that the safest thing for the Jews to do was to collaborate with the Romans. This was the priestly class, but they were also the aristocratic class, and they collaborated with the Romans, and the Romans ruled partly through them. And you remember Ananias, you remember Caiaphas. They don't get a good press in the Gospels, probably rightly. So you're living under Roman imperial oppression, you're living under Roman taxes, you're living under Roman military power, and the Jews hate it. And that's a good context for that story where Jesus says, if a Roman soldier asks you to carry something for 1 mile, do you remember it? Carry it 2 miles. Now you just imagine that. I'm walking home and some policeman comes up to me and gives me a big rucksack full of stones and says, I want you to carry it up to the Bursaldon roundabout. You know? That's the humiliation of what that really meant in context. Not nice. Temple priests were also resented. Now there are exceptions. Zechariah, we're told, was respected and liked in the beginning of Luke. But by and large there was a lot of resentment to the priests. So we get Roman taxes, temple taxes, and we get tax collectors. Now, you know, none of us love tax collectors, do we? But we passionately believe that our tax collectors are honest. They may be incompetent at times. They may overtax us. They may say, well, 25 years ago we overtaxed you, but never mind, that's too late to worry about. But by and large, we don't think they're corrupt. But think of the stories about the tax collectors in the New Testament and why they were so hated. They were corrupt, they took bribes, they oppressed people when they taxed them, and they weren't paid for the job, so they took their money from the taxes. They took their cut. And they also reported troublemakers. So you can see why they're hated in the New Testament, and their conversion is so exciting. But they also enforced Roman rule, took bribes and bullied people. And at times there were violent episodes against tax collectors, so they were isolated and disliked. This is the context in which John the Baptist and Jesus are ministering, and this is the way we can understand the New Testament much better. So the people suffered from four groups: the Romans, the Herodians, the priestly group, and the tax collectors, and they lived under Roman law. Now, I want to give you a parallel, a domestic parallel. If you've ever thought about what it would be like for Christians living in the old Soviet Union, or Christians living in China today, or perhaps in some Muslim countries, or you thought about how women are treated in Afghanistan, that's a parallel to the way the Jews lived in the time of the New Testament. It was like the Nazi occupation of Western Europe in the 40s. It was a horrible time and place to be. And we need to get that. We need to recognise that we've got occupation, oppression, collaboration, persecution, and impoverishment going on at the time of the New Testament and when it's written. And that gives us a much better insight into the New Testament and how we can understand it. Now, in some ways, the priestly approach worked. Judaism was actually a protected religion. Supposedly, did you know this? Under the Soviet Union, Christianity was a protected religion. It's just that you weren't allowed to worship, and you were persecuted. One famous example is a very famous Christian female poet who was imprisoned, and she was imprisoned on the grounds that she was mad, and of course she wasn't. She was just a Christian. So it's a protected religion, but twice a day priests sacrifice 2 lambs and an ox for the well-being of the emperor. This is the way you collaborate. And elsewhere sacrifices would be made to the emperor or to pagan gods. So Jewish culture is having this imposed on them in quite powerful ways. Now, it wasn't as bad as the period before this, when a Persian ruler broke into the temple and desecrated it completely and put pictures of himself everywhere claiming he was a god. It wasn't that bad, but it was bad enough. Pontius Pilate actually brought pagan banners into Jerusalem, which was a pretty insensitive thing to do. The Romans appointed the high priest, not the Jewish people. And Passover, that very important moment in the New Testament, was an incredibly tense time. Thousands of Jewish people flooded in from all over the Roman world to Jerusalem for Passover, and Pontius Pilate flooded Jerusalem with soldiers. It was a very tense time. That helps us understand why the high priests were so worried about Jesus ministering in Jerusalem, and why they said it would be good for the people if we could get rid of him. That gives us the context to what's going on in that period. But it culminated in AD 66 to 73 in an all-out Jewish revolt, and it culminated with the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, and the destruction of the whole Jewish way of life in terms of religion. And if you've ever studied Judaism beyond this period, it's the Pharisees who survive. It's the Pharisees who carry Judaism on into the future. The Sadducees are destroyed. Phariseeism is kind of the historical Judaism that we now live with, through the synagogue and not through the temple, because there was no temple. If you remember, much of the Old Testament is about why we must worship in Jerusalem, because we control worship then. But there's no Jerusalem to worship in one sense. So that's why the local synagogue is the centre of Jewish life and culture. Jerusalem and Judah were crushed, the temple was destroyed. So it was within the context of foreign occupation, corrupt officials, powerful and collaborating priests, that Jesus and John the Baptist ministered and people lived out their lives. When we understand that, the New Testament suddenly comes alive. And I'll give you another example of context about the New Testament. We have a very good friend, Judy and I, called Dan. And Dan is the kind of Christian who takes his faith incredibly seriously. So as a layman, he's taught himself New Testament Greek. Okay, now, some of us haven't done that yet. And he said, once he had understood New Testament Greek, the Bible opened up, completely opened up to a whole new understanding and approach to coping with what the Bible actually says. So again, it's another example of context. Okay, we're going to end by the cultural context, but I want to say a few things about this. Greek was the dominant culture in the ancient world. They were no longer politically powerful, no longer militarily powerful. Rome was the dominant power militarily and politically, but Greek was the dominant culture, and very, very powerful and very influential. I'm going to illustrate that a bit more in a while. Even under Rome. In the 3rd century BCE, or that means the Old Testament period, BC, there's a new way of doing that now. I don't know if you've come across it. We no longer use BC and AD. We now use BCE and CE, Common Era. It means before the Common Era and Common Era. In the 3rd century, the Old Testament was actually translated into Greek. And it's the Greek Old Testament that is quoted widely in the New Testament. Wherever you see an Old Testament quote in the New Testament, and that's regular, that's very common, they're quoting from the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament. Herod the Great did an enormous amount of Greek building. Greek thought and philosophy became enormously powerful and significant. Koine Greek, or Koine Greek, the lingua franca of the ancient world. It was the language used all over the ancient world by merchants, traders, aristocrats, unlike the common tongue that people might use, the farmers, the peasants. So it was a very widely used language, and the New Testament is written in that Greek. And we might say, why? Why wasn't it written in Aramaic? Because Jesus spoke Aramaic. Why was it written in Greek? It was written in Greek because it was an amazing way of actually communicating with people all over the Roman world. It was a really brilliant idea. Just as that wonderfully modern version that we have, the 1611 version, the authorised version of the Bible, was a brilliant way of communicating with people at the time. So they actually had their own Bible in English rather than it being in Latin. So that was enormously powerful and significant. Greek influence. Hellenic culture permeated Palestine and met with Jewish resistance. And we'll have a look briefly at why there was that resistance. But let's talk philosophy first. Who's come across Plato? Put your hands up if you've come across Plato. Okay. I don't mean you've read him. I don't mean you've studied him in depth. Just if you come... Who's come across Aristotle? Yeah, okay. And who's come across Socrates? Okay. One well-known modern British philosopher once said, and I think it's a fascinating quote, the whole of the history of Western philosophy is a footnote to Plato. Is a footnote to Plato. Plato's thought has been incredibly significant, and indeed one well-known Christian writer would say that he was actually using Platonic ideas within his Christian faith and Christian understanding. So philosophy was enormously significant in that period. Greeks were very interested in rationalism. Can we think our way up to God? Can we think our way to God? Can we use our intellect to make sense of God and God's existence? The problem was Old Testament Judaism and New Testament Judaism was a religion of revelation. God reveals himself downwards. We don't think our way upwards. We just try and understand the revelation. So there was a real mismatch going on there. They were interested in the human body, the Greeks. They were interested in theatre and human psychology. And John's Gospel shows very real evidence of Greek concepts and Greek ideas. What do they say about Jesus at the beginning of John's Gospel? In the beginning was the Word. That's the Greek word logos. The eternal principle. It's the Greek word logos. So there are Greek concepts going on even within our New Testament. They were interested in baths and sport, often naked, which really greatly offended Jewish people. They were interested in cultural relativism. What goes for one culture is fine for them. What goes in another culture is fine for them. What is your morality is fine, my morality is fine. It's all relative. Again, Jews would have hated that. Now, Jesus was raised in Galilee. He was raised where Hellenic and Jewish ideas met and mixed. It was a particularly open area to Greek thought. John the Baptist, I suspect, not so much. And the reason for that would have been that he's really a desert dweller. He may not have had the same Greek influence on his own thinking. But Jesus would have known this and it would have met with it. So was there some accommodation between Jewish and Greek thought? In one way, yes. In one way, there was an accommodation between Jewish and Greek thought. So if we take the example of Philo of Alexandria, who was a philosopher, Alexandria was the intellectual and cultural centre of the whole of the known world then. There were more Jews living in Alexandria than there were living in Palestine. And this was a real intellectual, cultural area. He applied Greek concepts to his Jewish faith, seeing Old Testament stories as allegorical, not historically true, but stories with meanings other than literally. So he allegorized the whole of the Old Testament. And the early church got into a point for some centuries where they allegorized the stories in the New Testament, not denying their literal historical truth, but seeing a deeper allegorical meaning behind the stories as well. So Philo of Alexandria. Plato's belief in an immortal soul fitted well with some Jews who believed in life after death. Which Jews particularly believed in life after death? It's the Pharisees who believed in life after death, and the Sadducees who denied it. They didn't believe there was a life after death. noteworthy that the Sadducees didn't survive the fall of Jerusalem, and the Pharisees went on to be the real founders of modern Judaism. Jesus also taught life after death. Now I'm going to say something controversial in a minute, but I'll just bear that in mind. In contrast, the official religion of the Roman Empire was very different to Judaism and Christianity, but again it would have been influential. Stoicism was agnostic about life after death, just said we can't know. They saw it as an unknowable mystery. They believed in deism, the idea that God created the universe, created this planet, but has nothing whatsoever to do with it. We used to say at college when I was teaching this, God creates the world and then goes off on a permanent holiday, and you never hear from him again. And there are many people who would claim to be deists. They would believe there is a God, but deny that this God has anything whatsoever to do with the world that's been created. And that's called deism. They denied human free will. They saw all things as predetermined. Wonderful way, isn't it, of avoiding moral responsibility. You know, if I go and shoot Penny, it's not my fault, I just had to do it, I had no choice, and of course I wouldn't. They urged concentrating on a virtuous life. Now, what do you think would have resonated with Jewish people from that list? What would have resonated with Jewish people from that list? Yeah, I reckon that's the only one. I would say the morality of Stoicism would have appealed to Jewish thinkers, but none of the rest of it. Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm going to end with a thought and a question. And the thought is not controversial, but the question is, John the Baptist and Jesus lived in the violent, intellectual, cultural maelstrom of the first century Palestine. When we understand that and understand it fully, we understand the New Testament better. We understand John the Baptist better, even though he may have been somewhat cut off from these influences. Jesus certainly wasn't. So here's my controversial question to get you going. Jesus was a devout Jew. We know he sees things through Jewish eyes. He's steeped in the Old Testament, as Jewish children were. How far were his ideas influenced by Greek thought? But actually the controversial bit here is, could Jesus be influenced by someone else's thought? Could Jesus be a product of the culture of the time? He's clearly a product of Judaism. Could he have been influenced by Greek thought? How do we cope with the point that Ken made last week, that Jesus was fully human and fully divine? Search back into your life. See the things that have influenced you, have had an effect on you, have helped to shape you. Okay? If Jesus was fully human, things must have shaped him. Things must have formed his thought and his understanding, his outlook, because he was fully human. And if we're not careful, we tend to see Jesus as kind of God in this vague body. Do you know what I mean? We don't see him as absolutely human, sweating, going to the toilet, being influenced by other ideas and other thoughts. And this is the kind of theologians wrestle with. If he's fully human, he knows and understands us. He knows and understands us. But if he's fully human, was he responsive as he grew up to some of these cultural, historical influences? So with that controversial thought, I finish. But if anyone wants to say anything about that, please do. I'd love to hear from you.
He spent more time with God than probably anybody else has ever done. So surely his greatest influence was God the Father, rather than the surrounding culture.
I totally agree.
And to back
Totally
up
agree.
that thought, I would say if he was fully divine, then his influence he selected from his environment
Yeah.
becomes influenced by the delight.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think both of those are a way of kind of dealing with that question. But nevertheless, as Neil said, those influences would have come in. He may well have then selected what he knew to be true because of his relationship with God. So it's wrestling with the balance, isn't it, between these two things.
Did God put him in that time room?
I think Christians would say very much yes.
God knew when it was going to happen, but God knew what was going to be happening.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
there are lots of reasons for saying yes to that.
Yeah.
And the most obvious one is the expansion of the Christian faith that is enabled by the Roman Empire, because it enabled travel and influence and ideas to spread out.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I think Christians would say the timing was just right.
Oh, yeah, it would be.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And
You refer to the region, continent of Palestine. Was that the term for the region at the time?
I don't know. I don't think it was actually, because there were all sorts of different bits of it, of which the Herodians became rulers. Galilee, Idumea, Judah. So there were different bits of it. So I'd use that word maybe wrongly as the generic area that we now call Israel, I suppose. Yeah.
What's the view about between the age of 12 and 13 in Jesus don't know that area, the world, finding out all about religions and cultures?
We just don't know, do we? We don't have any evidence for that one way or the other. We know he was resident in Galilee, Nazareth. We know he went to Jerusalem as a child. We think he probably inherited his father's work, because it may be that Joseph died quite early, but we don't know that for sure. So we don't know. And one of the things about the Gospels is there's so much we don't know. They chose what they wanted to write, and the joy is, conservative Christians would argue that the Gospel writers weren't robots writing what God directed them to write. They were human beings under the influence of the Holy Spirit who wrote and selected what they thought was important. And they obviously didn't think it was important to tell us what Jesus did. I'd love to know, and maybe that'll be a question I can ask someone who would really know in the future. Okay, thank you very much everyone. We'll finish there. Thank you.